Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what pulled you into this story. If it spoke to you, drop a comment. Your words help keep history's forgotten voices alive.
You hear the gunfire before you see the smoke. Dublin is a maze of burning rooftops and broken glass, the kind of city where every shadow looks like a soldier and every echo sounds like a last breath. The air tastes like ash. Posters for the Empire flap against the walls, half-burned, curling like they're trying to escape the brick beneath them. And then you see her. A woman steps out from the doorway of a shattered Georgian townhouse, boots crunching on fallen plaster. Her uniform is a tailored green coat with brass buttons that gleam even through the soot, the kind of coat no one expects a woman to wear. A revolver rests in her hand with the ease of something she's held 1,000 times. Her jaw is set. Her eyes are steady. Her hair is pinned back like she's going on stage, not into battle. The British soldiers across the green hesitate, just for a second, because this woman does not look afraid. She looks like she's exactly where she was meant to be. One soldier shouts a warning. Another raises his rifle. The world holds its breath. She fires first. The shot echoes through Dublin like a challenge. Hours later, when the barricades fall and the rebels are dragged from the streets in chains, the soldiers find her covered in soot, bruised, exhausted, but still unbroken. They call her names not meant for polite ears. They shove her. They curse her. She smirks, because fear is something she discarded long ago. At her court-martial, the British demand her final words before the execution they've already written for her. She lifts her chin and says, "I only regret that you are not brave enough to shoot me." The courtroom goes silent. And that silence, that moment when an empire realizes it has underestimated a woman, that's the moment Countess Constance Markievicz becomes dangerous. But to understand how a woman born into privilege became the most defiant rebel in Ireland, to understand how she terrified kings, outmaneuvered generals, and refused to die when they told her to, you have to go back to the beginning, before the uniform, before the rifles, before the revolution, back to the little girl who should have grown up gentle and obedient, and instead grew up unbreakable. Constance Markievicz, Ireland's rebel queen without a crown. The girl who refused to be quiet. Long before Dublin burned, before rifles and revolutions, there was a place called Lissadell House, a grand Anglo-Irish estate stretched along the Sligo coast, where the wild Atlantic winds beat against manicured gardens and marble halls. It was the kind of place where children were supposed to grow up delicate, charming, trained to curtsy rather than question. But Constance Gore Booth never got that memo. She rode horses before she could write her name, climbed trees in dresses meant for tea parties, galloped through fields so fast the maids couldn't keep up, trailing behind her like frantic flags. Tutors tried to train her into a proper young lady, gentle, soft, agreeable. But Constance out-argued every one of them. She preferred muddy boots to polished shoes, preferred exploring the tenant cottages to hosting guests, preferred the stories of Irish heroes and rebels whispered by local workers over the dull biographies approved by her governess. It wasn't that she rejected privilege, it was that she recognized it, too clearly, too young. The Gore Booth family was wealthy, comfortable, untouched by hunger or eviction. But Constance saw the other side of the estate, the families who lived in cottages with leaking roofs, the children with bare feet in winter, the quiet endurance in the faces of tenant farmers who worked land they didn't own. Ireland itself was a split country, half in rebellion, half in chains, and Constance learned that lesson early. Some children grow up protected from truth. She grew up staring it in the face. She learned to shoot, to ride, to argue, to question. She learned to see Ireland not as a peaceful countryside, but as a storm waiting for someone brave enough to step into it. And even as a child, people whispered that Constance Gore Booth carried something volatile inside her. Not anger, not arrogance, but conviction. Conviction is dangerous in a woman. Conviction in a girl is practically a prophecy. By the time Constance realized her life was supposed to be a straight line, marriage, mansion, motherhood, she was already veering off course with a speed that terrified her family and thrilled everyone else. Because rebellion doesn't start with rifles. It starts with a question whispered in the wrong room. And Constance had just begun asking. Constance Gore Booth grew into a young woman the same way a fire grows, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Lissadell House expected a future of polished speeches, strategic marriages, and quiet charity. But Constance wanted a life that didn't fit inside drawing rooms. She wanted movement, she wanted colour, she wanted the world. So she ran toward it. First London, then Paris. Cities pulsing with invention, noise, politics, dreams and bad ideas. And for the first time in her life, no one greeted her as Miss Gore Booth, daughter of an Anglo-Irish landowner. Instead, they asked a simpler question. Who are you? It was a terrifying question. It was a liberating question. She answered it with a paintbrush. Paris, the city where Constance began to unravel and rebuild. Paris was a fever of contradictions. Poets drunk by noon, painters who argued about truth at 3 a.m., radicals shouting about revolution between bites of cheap bread. And Constance threw herself into all of it, studying art with single-minded hunger. She painted until her fingers cramped, debated politics until her voice went hoarse, sat in cafes listening to arguments about socialism, nationalism, workers' rights, women's rights, Irish independence, divine justice, and human folly. She discovered that art wasn't just decoration, it was rebellion with better edges. And she began to transform. The crisp, polished manners of Lissadell softened. The sharp edges of curiosity grew sharper. She cut her hair, stopped apologizing for speaking too loudly, stopped pretending to be impressed by aristocrats who mistook wealth for wisdom. Paris introduced her to herself. That's where she met him, Count Constance Markievicz. He was Polish, charming, a painter with dramatic cheekbones and even more dramatic emotional swings. He admired her art. She admired his defiance of rules. They fell in love the inconvenient way, messy, bright, too fast. When they married, she became Countess Markievicz, a title meant to elevate her. She wore it like a shield. But the title wasn't the transformation. Casimir wasn't the transformation. Ireland was. Back in Dublin, something in the air buzzed like static. It wasn't the Dublin she'd grown up visiting. This Dublin was restless, fierce, awake. A cultural revival swept through the city. The Gaelic League teaching the banned Irish language, actors resurrecting old Irish myths, poets writing about freedom with dangerous clarity. Constance hadn't come back intending to join them. But revolutions are contagious. She met Maud Gonne, political firelight in human form. She met W.B. Yeats, who fell mildly, poetically in love with every passionate woman he met. She met organizers, thinkers, conspirators, ordinary people refusing to wait for permission to be free. And Constance felt something inside her shift. A childhood filled with injustice, a youth filled with curiosity, a marriage filled with questions, and now a cause. She didn't just feel Irish, she felt responsible. She joined the Gaelic League, learning the language she wasn't raised to speak, but was destined to fight for. She joined Incinetha na hÉireann, the radical nationalist women's group, causing respectable Dublin to clutch its pearls. And slowly, with each meeting, each rally, each whispered conversation in smoky rooms, Constance Markievicz shed the last of her aristocratic training. She wasn't just an artist, or a countess, or a rebel in waiting. She was becoming dangerous. Revolutions, like storms, start with pressure. Ireland was reaching its breaking point. Poverty, oppression, absentee landlords, centuries of British rule. And Constance, who grew up in privilege, now stood in the slums, handing out food, teaching children to read, delivering speeches that shook people awake. A countess in muddy boots. A woman of high birth kneeling beside starving families. A lady of society giving her jewelry away to fund soup kitchens. People didn't know what to make of her. Was she confused? Was she mad? Was she holy? Or was she simply done pretending that polite society mattered more than human beings? Constance wasn't just changing, she was choosing. Choosing Ireland over England, the poor over aristocrats, justice over comfort, fire over safety. And that choice had consequences. Because once you give your heart to a cause, you can't be surprised when it demands the rest of you. The soldier. The empire didn't see coming. Revolution doesn't announce its arrival. It slips in quietly, through letters shared in secret, through meetings behind shuttered pub doors, through the way a crowd leans forward when someone brave enough begins a sentence with, "What if?" By the time Constance Markievicz realized she wasn't just sympathizing with the movement, but becoming part of it, Ireland was already rumbling beneath her feet. You could feel it everywhere. In the music halls, the union offices, the poetry readings, the whispers passed between dock workers, the anger simmering in crowded tenements, the sense that a nation could only bend so far before something snapped. And Constance? She snapped right with it, but not into violence, into purpose. The Irish Citizen Army, ICA, wasn't a polite organization. It wasn't a charity circle or a debating club. It was a workers' militia formed after police brutally beat peaceful protesters during the 1913 lockout. These were men who had been starved, beaten, evicted, exploited. They weren't looking for symbolic gestures. They wanted protection. They wanted justice. They wanted weapons. When Constance walked into their headquarters, a converted shed behind Liberty Hall, every conversation stopped. The men stared, confused, amused, a bit threatened, unsure whether to laugh, salute, or ask if she was lost. A countess? Here? Constance didn't blink. "I want to join," she said simply. Not as a mascot, not as a fundraiser, as a soldier. The men tried to protest. "It's dangerous. It's not suitable. It's no place for a woman." Constance didn't flinch. "I'm not here because it's suitable," she replied. "I'm here because it's necessary." James Connolly, the ICA's leader, a man whose backbone was forged in poverty and rebellion, saw something in her the others missed. Something familiar. Conviction. He welcomed her. If the ICA expected her to show up in a long skirt and gloves, they learned quickly who they were dealing with. Constance designed her own uniform. A sharply tailored green tunic, high black boots, a Sam Brown belt, and a revolver holstered at her hip. She cut a figure that made people pause, not because she looked out of place, but because she looked like she belonged more than anyone else. Men stared. Women whispered. Children followed her in awe. A woman in uniform wasn't just a curiosity. It was a rebellion all its own. The ICA didn't hand out respect like charity. You earned it. Constance earned it, brutally, relentlessly, without complaint. Mud drills, rifle shooting, hand-to-hand combat, route marches through rain so heavy it felt like punishment. When younger recruits struggled, she trained them personally. When food was scarce, she ate last. When ammunition ran low, she took the most dangerous shifts. If a man questioned her place there, Constance fought harder. If he mocked her, she humiliated him in the yard with her aim. Within weeks, no one asked whether she belonged. They only asked where she needed them to stand. Her bravery and training wasn't the only thing that drew people to her. Constance helped start soup kitchens for starving families during the lockout. By day, she fed Dublin's hungry. By night, she drilled with rifles. It confused the British, infuriated the aristocracy, inspired the working class. Who was she? An aristocrat? A socialist? A nationalist? A rebel? Constance smiled when people asked. She was whatever Ireland needed. Revolutionary movements aren't romantic fairy tales. They're held together by the exhausted, the desperate, and the determined. Constance saw it all. 10-year-olds sleeping on factory floors, women standing in bread lines for hours with infants on their hips, men who'd worked themselves into early graves. These were the people she fought for. These were the people whose names she carried into every meeting, every strategy session, every skirmish. She was born into privilege, yes, but privilege didn't protect her from empathy. It propelled her into danger. There's a moment in every revolution when participants become icons, not by choice, but by necessity. For Constance, it happened when James Connolly placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Command the Green." St. Stephen's Green, one of Dublin's main positions, a battlefield. And he gave it to her. Not because she was a woman, not because she was a countess, but because she was the best person for the job. And on the eve of the Easter Rising, Constance Markievicz strapped on her revolver, checked her ammunition, tied back her hair, and walked into history with the calm of someone who has already accepted the cost. Easter Rising, a woman at the barricades. Dawn breaks hard over Dublin on April 24, 1916. Not gently, not quietly. The sun claws its way through a sky already grey with gunpowder, as if even the heavens are reluctant to watch what's coming. Constance Markievicz wakes before first light, uniform already laid out, boots polished, revolver in reach. She braids her hair with the quick, practiced motions of someone preparing for war, not vanity. Outside her window, the city she has spent years fighting for still sleeps, innocent for a few more minutes. She breathes once, deep and steady. Today is the day. The Irish Citizen Army gathers at Liberty Hall, faces sharp with determination and fear they refuse to show. Men and women both, young and old. Workers, poets, clerks, labourers. A rebellion stitched together from hope and exhaustion. When Constance arrives, a hush passes through the courtyard. Not because she's a countess, but because she's the one person they know won't flinch. James Connolly steps forward. "St. Stephen's Green is yours," he says. She nods. No speech, no hesitation, just purpose. St. Stephen's Green at sunrise is usually peaceful. Birdsong, dew on the grass, lovers strolling under budding trees. Not today. Constance arrives with her company and immediately takes command. "Dig trenches," she orders, pointing toward the lawn. "Barricades there and there. Riflemen along the north edge." Some volunteers glance instinctively toward the Shelbourne Hotel, the towering luxury building that overlooks the entire park. Constance follows their gaze. The realization hits fast and cruel. "If they put snipers up there," she says quietly, "we won't last an hour." But there's no time to change strategy. The rising is already in motion. She rolls up her sleeves and digs alongside her men, shoveling soil with mud splattering her uniform. Anyone watching would never guess she was born into an estate with servants. She doesn't work like a noblewoman. She works like someone who has everything to lose. Shots crack through the air. The Shelbourne Hotel has awakened. Rooftop, windows, balconies. Sniper flashes bloom like tiny explosions. Bullets rip through branches. Volunteers dive for cover. Dirt kicks up in violent spurts. And Constance Markievicz stands tall. A British sniper takes aim at one of her young men, a boy barely old enough to shave. Constance raises her rifle, breath steady, hands sure. She fires once. The sniper drops from the window. Half the volunteers freeze in stunned silence. The other half look at her with new eyes. She doesn't celebrate. She doesn't apologize. She just reloads. War is war. For hours, gunfire rains down on the trenches. Every time a volunteer falters, Constance crawls across open ground, mud soaking her uniform, to steady them. At one point, she tears strips from her own shirt to bandage a man's bleeding arm. By mid-afternoon, the dead lie in the grass like scattered clothing. The rising heat turns the park into a cauldron. The smell of gunpowder mixes with blood and crushed clover. 3 times, Constance runs into crossfire to drag wounded men to safety. 3 times, she shouldn't have survived. 3 times, she does. By the second night, they're running low on ammunition. By the third, they're running low on hope. The order comes quietly. A whisper passed from trench to trench. Retreat. Constance's jaw tightens. Surrender is one thing, retreat is another. But she obeys, because leadership isn't always about bravery. Sometimes it's about loss. They slip out of the park under the cover of darkness, crawling through hedges while snipers sweep their rifles across the empty green, unaware their targets have vanished. Constance leads from the middle, keeping the strongest in front, the wounded behind her. Mud stains her face. Her voice is soft, steady, calm, like she's guiding children through a storm. And in a way, she is. They regroup at the Royal College of Surgeons, exhausted, hungry, shaking. Constance takes up a sniper position on a windowsill, firing only when absolutely necessary, her precision terrifying even her comrades. She hasn't slept in 3 days. She hasn't eaten in 2. Her cheek is swollen from the recoil of her rifle, but her eyes burn bright. On Saturday, the white flags rise, not because the rebels are weak, but because Dublin is dying. Civilians are being killed, buildings are collapsing, fires rage in the streets. The city can't take another hour. When the British soldiers finally storm the building, guns raised, they find Constance Markievicz, still in uniform, mud-streaked, exhausted, trembling, but with her chin held so high it looks like defiance carved from marble. "Are you the Countess Markievicz?" a British officer demands. She answers, "I am." He orders her to remove her weapon. She lays it down slowly, like a queen placing a crown on a velvet pillow. As they drag her away in chains, she breaks down, not from fear, but because she believes the rising has failed. She doesn't yet know she will become its symbol. She doesn't yet know her death sentence will be commuted. She doesn't yet know that her refusal to bow will echo louder than any rifle. She doesn't yet know that this moment, mud on her boots, wrists bound, tears streaking soot down her face, will make her immortal. Because sometimes the only thing more powerful than victory is a woman who refuses to break in defeat. Prison, Parliament, and the woman who refused to disappear. They chained her hands, marched her through burning streets, and locked her behind the thick stone walls of Kilmainham jail. They thought the prison would break her. It didn't. The cell is small, cold, unforgiving, a rectangle of grey with a cot so thin it feels like punishment by design. The Rising's leaders are being executed one by one. Dublin wakes every morning to the sound of gunshots, a rhythm of grief. And in her cell, Constance Markievicz listens. Every morning the reports crack like thunder. Every morning another comrade falls. Every morning she wonders if today is her day. It should have been. The British court-martial sentenced her to death, same as the others. But then came the footnote, the line whispered rather than announced, to be commuted to life in prison on account of her sex. Sex, not innocence, not mercy, not justice. A technicality of gender spared her life, and she hated it. She told the guards that if they meant to kill her, they should at least have the decency to do it properly. She told them she would rather die with the men than live because she wasn't considered worth a bullet. But they didn't listen. They never did. Constance was moved from prison to prison, Kilmainham to Mountjoy, then to Aylesbury in England. Cold floors, hard beds, hunger that gnawed the edges of sanity. But she fought back. She wrote letters that burned with conviction. She sketched plans for Ireland's future on scraps of paper. She paced the floors until her boots tore at the seams. She sang rebel songs so loudly the guards complained. When the warden tried to silence her, she only got louder. When other women faltered, she lifted them. When her health collapsed, she dragged herself upright again, running on sheer will. Her body weakened, her spirit sharpened. She didn't pray, she planned. And outside the prison walls, Ireland, battered, grieving, furious, began to change. The executed leaders became martyrs. The Rising, once mocked, became a national awakening. And Constance Markievicz, the woman in the green uniform, the sniper at St. Stephen's Green, the rebel who refused to cry before surrendering, became a symbol, not of defeat, of possibility. In 1918, from inside a prison cell, Constance Markievicz was elected to the British Parliament. Let that sink in. A woman, in chains, was chosen by the Irish people to represent them in London. She didn't even have the right to vote for herself. Women in Britain wouldn't gain full suffrage for years. But Ireland chose her anyway. The British press sputtered with outrage, cartoons mocked her, politicians sneered. Constance ignored them. She refused to take her seat in Westminster, honouring Sinn Féin's policy of abstention. Instead, she became a minister in the Irish Revolutionary Government, the first woman in Europe to hold a cabinet position. The men respected her, the British feared her, the public adored her. It was the exact outcome the Empire wanted to avoid. But rebellion has a price, and she paid it in installments. Years of prison had ravaged her health. Years of starvation had worn her frame thin. Years of running from bullets had left her lungs scarred. She kept going anyway. She gave her money to the poor. She fed starving children. She nursed the sick. She fought, argued, rallied, marched, shouted. She never stopped until her body made the decision for her. In 1927, at the age of 59, Constance Markievicz collapsed from complications of appendicitis. She died in a public hospital, penniless by choice, surrounded not by aristocrats, but by the working-class women she had fought for. Over 250,000 people lined the streets of Dublin for her funeral, the kind usually reserved for kings, not rebels. Maybe because Constance Markievicz wasn't just a rebel. She was the reminder of what happens when a woman refuses to die quietly. History tried to define her: aristocrat, rebel, sniper, traitor, hero, mother of Irish independence. But none of those labels are big enough. She was the paradox every empire fears. A woman born into privilege who turned that privilege into a weapon against the powerful. A woman who learned the rules not to follow them, but to break them, bend them, turn them inside out. A woman who proved that courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like mud-stained boots, a steady trigger finger, and a refusal to bow. And that is why Constance Markievicz still stands taller than the men who tried to silence her. Because she didn't survive the rising. She survived everything after. And women who survive history's punishments tend to become history's warnings. The aftershock. What history does with a woman it can't erase. When the earth finally stopped shaking, when the uprisings faded into textbooks and the gun smoke into memory, Ireland had to decide what to do with Constance Markievicz. And like every nation confronted with a woman who refused to stay in her assigned place, it stumbled. Some called her a hero, others called her reckless. Some praised her bravery, others blamed her for the bloodshed she didn't start, but refused to back away from. And some, mostly men in polished shoes and tidy suits, whispered that she was too emotional, too radical, too much. But none of them could deny the truth. She changed the landscape under their feet. Constance wasn't a footnote, she was a tectonic shift, and the aftershocks of what she did rippled far beyond her own lifetime. Walk through Dublin today and you'll find her name everywhere, in plaques, memorials, murals, schools. But the real monument is the political reality she helped create. Because after her, no one, not even the most ironclad patriarch, could say women didn't belong in politics. No one could say women didn't have the stomach for war or the intellect for strategy. No one could claim that leadership was something given to men by divine right. Constance had shattered that argument with a rifle and a uniform. But she also forced Ireland into a contradiction it still wrestles with. How do you celebrate a woman who saved your nation while also admitting you once tried to bury her? Her legacy became the kind people talk around but not about, because speaking about her honestly means confronting something uncomfortable. She did what men do in war, and people weren't ready to see a woman do it. Most history books try to tidy her up. They trim away the sharp edges. They sand down the rage. They paint her as a spirited patriot, a heroic but complicated woman, a noble figure who was perhaps a little too extreme, which is a polite way of saying they want her to be palatable. Because the real Constance Markievicz is harder to hold. She shot soldiers. She led armed battalions. She defied governments. She rejected the privileges of her own class. She fought with fire, not diplomacy. She lived loud, died defiant, and refused to soften herself for anyone. That is not the kind of woman history likes to place on pedestals. Men who do those things are founders and war heroes. Women who do them are problems. Constance was both, and neither, and something far larger. In the final years of her life, Constance looked nothing like the glamorous aristocrat she once was. She wore threadbare clothes. She slept little. She worked tirelessly. She gave her last coins to the poor because someone always needed it more. But she still had that fire, the fire that made men nervous and women stand taller. She had outlasted bullets, kings, governments, courts, hunger, prison cells, scandals, and the empire itself. So when she finally died, quietly in a public hospital, her fortune spent, her health gone, it wasn't a defeat. It was the final proof. She didn't need privilege, wealth, or approval to leave a mark. She didn't need a throne or a crown. All she needed was conviction. And that, more than anything, is why she terrified the powerful. Because a woman who fights is frightening. But a woman who fights without fear? That's a revolution. The woman history tried to forget, and failed. There is something strange, almost ironic, about how history treats women like Constance Markievicz. When they're alive, they are called dangerous. When they're dead, they're called complicated. And when enough time passes, they are called legends. Constance fits all three. Because when the smoke cleared and the revolution she bled for became a nation, Ireland had a choice: erase her or claim her. In the end, the country did both. Irish schoolbooks trimmed the fire out of her. They kept the uniform, but erased the bullets. They kept the speeches, but softened the fury. They kept the patriotism, but cut away the part where she challenged her own allies harder than her enemies. The Constance they taught children was tidy, obedient, inspirational. The real Constance? She was a storm in human form. Too loud, too radical, too willing to fight, too unwilling to apologize. History loves heroines, but only if they behave. Constance never did. By the time she died in 1927, Constance had worn through almost every piece of herself. Her voice had grown rougher. Her hands were worn. Her fortune was gone. Her body was failing. Yet her eyes, witnesses said, still held that defiant spark, the one that made men look away and made women feel seen. She had lived several lives: aristocrat, artist, activist, rebel, soldier, political prisoner, cabinet minister, legend. Each life took something from her. Each one also carved her deeper into history's stone. But there was a final truth, whispered by those who actually knew her. Constance never regretted a single battle. The morning her body was carried through Dublin, tens of thousands lined the streets, rich and poor, old revolutionaries and young dreamers, women in shawls, men with bowed heads, children who had grown up hearing stories of Madame Markievicz, the woman who lived and fought like she feared nothing at all. No British officer watched over her this time. No prison walls enclosed her. No sentence hovered above her head. She belonged fully, publicly, to the country she had nearly died for. Even those who hated her politics had to admit something. If courage were currency, Constance Markievicz would have been the wealthiest woman in Ireland. Time did what time always does. It turned her enemies into footnotes. It turned her critics into dust. It turned the scandals into trivia. But Constance? She grew larger. Because every era discovers her again. Whenever women take up space in politics, her ghost walks beside them. Whenever a nation debates who deserves power, her name flickers. Whenever a girl learns she doesn't have to shrink, soften, or apologize to survive, Constance is there, grinning, a rebel's grin. She is no longer just a figure of Irish history. She is a symbol of a universal truth. A woman's power is most threatening when she no longer asks permission for it. Why she still matters. She didn't become a revolutionary because she was fearless. She became one because she decided fear wasn't reason enough to stand still. She didn't lead because she wanted to be admired. She led because she couldn't bear to be silent. And she didn't survive because luck protected her. She survived because she fought back harder than the world expected any woman to fight. Constance Markievicz was not gentle history. She was a razor wrapped in velvet, a battle cry disguised as a lady, a woman who refused to fade. And long after her bones returned to the earth, her defiance still stands. Her story still burns. Her revolution never ended.
And that's where we leave her. On the page, in the archive, in the rumor, in the shadow she carved into history. Maybe she was a villain. Maybe she was a victim. Maybe she was something far more dangerous. A woman who refused the role she was handed. But one thing is certain. The world wasn't ready for her then, and it still isn't now. If you enjoyed falling down this rabbit hole of power, defiance, and the women history tried to bury, make sure you're here for the next chapter, because there are more of them, more rebels, more survivors, more legends disguised as scandals. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you were told, and keep an eye on the women they warned you about.